Good morning, and welcome to the Alameda Connection on KCSM HD2. I'm your host, Scott Piehler. Back in September, my first guest on the Alameda Connection was Rachel Lee, the Executive Director of the California Historical Radio Society, which is home to the Bay Area Radio Hall of Fame. This week, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome one of those Hall of Famers to the microphone, former KCBS morning news anchor Stan Bunger. For years, Stan's voice was a staple of Bay Area morning radio. And for many of those years, he shared the airwaves with the legendary John Madden, as Stan detailed in his excellent 2024 book, Mornings with Madden. We spent time talking about Stan's Bay Area upbringing, his broadcast career, which included broadcasting live from Candlestick Park during the 1989 earthquake, his Mornings with Madden, and his current work, cataloging and archiving important recordings from across the history of Bay Area radio. That's Stan Bunger, my guest this morning on the Alameda Connection. Well, good morning, Stan, and welcome to the Alameda Connection.
Scott, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
First of all, congratulations on being the first guest to have spent more time behind a microphone than I have.
I don't know whether to be honored by that or not.
I kind of feel like the guy who just invited Bobby Flay to his backyard cookout.
Well, I don't bite. I'm just thrilled to talk about radio and Alameda both because I'm very passionate about both. I was just lucky to stumble into a career that paid the bills and didn't chew me up too badly, and out of which I walked as a fairly happy guy.
Bay Area native. Let's talk about your childhood for a minute.
Born in San Francisco, French hospital. Mom and dad moved to Los Gatos. So I grew up in an orchard until age 8. Literally, there was a house in the middle of an apricot and prune orchard. And my brother and I could run around out there and just be, it was staggeringly cool to know that we grew up in the agricultural Santa Clara Valley before it was the Silicon Valley. Family moved to South San Jose when I was 8. Ended up going to Lee High School, West Valley Community College, and then to San Francisco State University. Got my degree in radio television in 1977. Was lucky enough to find my first radio job in King City, California, a real garden spot, astride Highway 101 in Monterey County, KRKC. It was owned by a solo operator, a guy named Bob McVeigh, who had put the station on the air and run it himself for a number of years. It was really magical in a way because I was the news director, which meant I was the entire news staff, and also the morning DJ for the first hour and a half or so until one of the big bosses came in to do the morning show. You know, I had to call the sheriff's department and the police department overnight to say, anything happened?
Right.
Yeah, a shopping cart theft at the Safeway. You know, it was that kind of stuff. And I covered the school board meetings.
I can totally relate because I had a couple of gigs in New Hampshire in small market, and it was literally, I was the farm report.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I cotton, futures. Yeah, it was crazy. But it was fun. I had a great deal of fun, and I couldn't wait to get out of the town. It's pretty small town. Ended up in Sonora, California after that, in the Sierra foothills. Another station essentially built by his own hands by Joe Harold, the operator of that station. And then it was the big time, baby. I got all the way to South Lake Tahoe, California.
Oh, boy.
A 2-station market, maybe a 3-station market. Yeah, and all the way along, just fun. I never served in the military. I did play sports, and I think those kinds of bonds that you build in experiences like that stick with you forever.
I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm going to ask you a question based on that story. So my mother knew I was headed to radio when I got lost as a child in an A&S department store on Long Island. And this was back when they would announce the child's name. And so it was, would Scott's mother please come? And she expected to find a crying child. I looked at her smiling and said, my name was in the air. So when did radio speak to you?
You know, I loved listening to radio as a kid. I would DX, I guess you'd call it now. I mean, I had a Zenith that I could sneak under the covers and listen to distant stations. My grandparents had a transoceanic, and when I would go to their place in Denver in the summer, we'd pull in shortwave. So I would say I was captivated and enthralled by what radio was, but I can't say that I had any intent of doing radio. I was going to be a marine biologist. I had to write a paper in a freshman English class that said, you know, what do you want to do with your life? For some reason, the idea of telling stories and sharing them with large groups of people kind of cemented itself in my mind. And then we had to write another paper the next semester with the same professor about, okay, now that you've decided what you want to do, where are you going to go after community college to learn how to do it? And that led me to broadcasting at SF State. And news was not really my original goal. I got to SF State. We had a student station. I walked in to sign up to be a DJ, but all the cool kids had already gotten the DJ shifts. Big open expanse on the column that said news. All right, I'll do that. And that was it. I never looked back.
What was it like being on the air during the 1989 earthquake?
It's a big story for me because my dad had taken me to Giants games as a kid. And I'd reached the point by then where I owned season tickets to the Giants. I'd had a negotiation with KCBS a few years earlier, and they weren't going to pay me much. But my boss said, hey, maybe if you ask for something that the station can trade out. Okay, so
very good.
Season tickets down close. It was a big night for me. The game was going to start at 5:07 or whatever, and 5:15, and I was going to take Dad to the game. So Dad came up from San Jose. We, at the time on KCBS, carried the World Series on CBS radio.
Okay, right.
So my job had been to anchor the lead up in the afternoon from the press box upstairs, and then hand it off to the baseball broadcast, and then I could go enjoy the ball game with my dad, have a beer, have a hot dog, and revel in my great fortune to be able to take my dad to a World Series game. Then the earthquake hit. And it was stunning, and the indelible memory was having to tackle Mike Woodley, who was a KCBS sports anchor at the time, had played college hockey at Mankato State in Minnesota, and Mike still was a pretty burly dude. When it hit, his eyes became the size of 12-inch LPs, and he turned and ran. As he ran, he didn't realize, we realized, he still had his headset on, and was pulling the entire mixer and everything with him. And the only way to stop this was to tackle him. And the only person close to him to get arms around his waist was me. That's how it began. We became really the Bay Area's beacon. KGO went off the air for hours. We stayed on the air. Of course, the rest is really history. The drama of it, the importance of being the voice in the Bay Area at a time of great crisis. Today it would be different, right? Because you'd have other ways of learning the news. There was no internet then, barely cell phone service. I mean, it was very rudimentary. So we were it.
And you wound up with a Peabody for that.
Yeah, the station won a Peabody Award. Richly deserved. This is not bragging. This is a point of great pride. Everyone on that station raised their game 6 notches above expectations, including the guy who had to go to the basement of the building and crank diesel fuel into a 55-gallon drum with one of those jackrabbit pumps, a hand pump, go over to the one elevator that still had some emergency power, haul it up to the roof of the building where our emergency generator to run our equipment in the studios, and hand crank it back into the tank on the generator on the roof for many, many days. He reeked of diesel fuel. But without that guy, the station goes off the air, and the rest of the story doesn't happen.
How'd you wind up in Dallas?
Well, I'd reached a bit of a mid-career crisis at KCBS, to be perfectly honest. You talk about baseball players. I always fall back on sports analogies. You got a really good, smooth-feeling, good-hitting first baseman, but he's stuck in the minors because there's already a guy on the big club. And I was kind of that minor league kid. I didn't have the morning slot. I was angsty. I wanted more than what I was doing. KCBS at that time was a real box. The format was the king, not the people. My boss, Charlie Seraphin, who had hired me at KCBS in 1982, had wound up at KRLD, a legacy station in Dallas, which it turns out was really in trouble.
Oh, no.
I didn't know that when I got there, but I did get a 3-year no-cut contract. My wife and I looked at each other and said, you know what the heck? And it was a grand adventure. Made a lot of great friends there. Learned to love Texas. But they were neighborly and friendly in a way that I often didn't find here and still don't find here.
And I think to any Californian, before you judge Texas, go to Austin. Then you may pass judgment.
Yeah, I think that's true. San Antonio as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And there are pockets or outposts of great gentility in Texas. There's also some weird stuff, but I like weird. When Kinky Friedman was running for governor of Texas way back when, I was pretty much on board with that.
So in 95, you come back to the Bay Area for television.
I came back to the Bay Area with nothing.
Really?
Yeah. We had made the decision to come back. My contract at KRLD was running out. They let me go in April of 1995. The next morning, I went out for a bike ride. When I came back from the ride, my wife said, man, something must have happened because everybody wants you. So I'd gotten phone calls from KCBS. Channel 2 had also called. There'd been this bombing in Oklahoma City, and they knew I wasn't that far away. Could I get up there? So I got in my car and ripped up there and reported for a couple of days. That kind of got my foot back in the Bay Area door. We made the decision to move back here without a job.
Okay.
We knew that the prospects in Dallas weren't good. There was one other radio station, WBAP, where I might have found work television at the time wasn't really an option. I hadn't done it. So we came back and I did some fill-in work at KPIX FM, which was an aborted attempt to run all news or heavy news on the FM side. Westinghouse tried. The OJ trial kept them alive for longer than it should have. And I did some fill-in work at KNBR. As we sit here recording this, I just learned of the passing of Bob Lazich, who was a news guy at KNBR for many years, and I got to meet Laz during that phase. But nothing. And so I began kind of reaching out, and what landed in my lap was this job at Channel 36 in San Jose, producing Silicon Valley Business This Week. I had never produced a television show since a failed attempt during my college days. I learned technology. I had decided I wanted to cover technology because I could see that was going to be a thing. Right. And it got me out of the day-to-day murders and mayhem. That led to the job at Channel 36, which led to the job the following year working for KRON and its cable channel Bay TV, producing, reporting, and eventually co-hosting a show that was called New Media News and then Next Step. So that was my TV sojourn, and I thought that would last. Of course, it didn't.
When did you move to Alameda?
We moved to Alameda in 1988. We had been over here a few times from San Francisco to hang out with friends who had bought homes in the Harbor Bay Isle, and we were captivated by suburbia and a neighborhood that was close to San Francisco, and we had kids who couldn't ride their scooters on the hills in the San Francisco neighborhoods where we lived. So over we came. Never looked back. Sold the house when we moved in 92 to Texas, but then came right back and bought another one after our return in 1996. At retirement, thought about maybe going somewhere else, but roots are too deep now. Having lived here mostly since 1988, I am, as you well know, barely a beginner as an Alameda. Right. My kids, both born in San Francisco but raised here, are sort of Alamedans.
Right. As my father is fond of saying, you become a local when the last person who remembers you moving in dies.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
In the biz, as they say, people don't often return to stations that they left.
And I think back on that. In 2000, I was pulling up in front of KRON's facility to go in and do some work, probably in the archives. And I got a phone call from one of the news managers at KCBS saying, hey, listen, Al Hart's going to retire. Would you consider coming back? And that had been 8 years since I had left the station. I realized in that moment I must not have lit all the matches that were in my pocket to light the bridge on fire on the way out. I had a few. The second thing I realized was they didn't have a succession plan. There was no plan B. We had several conversations. It was obvious that it was the right thing to do and the right time for me to do it. As it turns out, the TV thing was fading away. Okay. My choices were either going to be join the regular news staff at KRON, and there was sort of an open offer from the news managers there. I really didn't want to do that. I didn't want to go out and cover any more fires and murders. Right. And so instead, I ended up back at KCBS doing news. But when I came back, that old thing about you can't go home, when you do go home, life is different. And to their credit, and to the eternal credit of Ed Cavanero, who is the longtime program director, news director at KCBS, he bent his own personal beliefs. He bent the station's thinking a bit and allowed me to be me. And that really changed everything. Mm-hmm. And working with John Madden as part of the job, he was already there when I came back, opened great big doors to me to realize, it's okay to be a human being with the news, not just rattling off facts. Right. I knew where the boundary was. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to be a commentator. I didn't want to be an editorialist. But the second go around was very sweet. And
you wound up staying there for 21 years, which for people who are not in the industry, that's a millennium.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. Well, that station is like that, though.
As a lifelong East Coaster myself until 2022, when I got out here and you were coming out with your book, we had no idea this went on. He had a morning radio spot? John Madden?
Yeah, it's crazy too, Scott, because, and the book grew out of this one observation. When John passed away in December of 2021, so about 6 months after I'd retired, I read all the obits. I was shattered, but not stunned. I'd seen John. I knew his health wasn't great. Not one of the obits said a thing about these radio shows he'd done. He did morning radio in the Bay Area longer than he did anything else in his career, longer than he was a head coach, longer than he did the NFL on television, longer than the Madden video game. And so I thought, well, that's a story that needs to be told, right? Plus I had part of it. And so I sat down and wrote a freelance piece, pitched it to the Chronicle. I can name names. None of them picked it up. I ended up revamping it for the CHRS, California Historical Radio Society Quarterly Journal. And I kind of thought that was it. And then the more I thought about it, And I had friends saying, you should write a book about this. And most of them said, you should write a book about you. And I thought, but the Madden radio story deserved telling. And of course, so many people remembered so many of his moments. I was lucky that we had thousands of recordings of those shows. They were physically in my hands. I went over and got him out of the closet at the radio station because who knows? You leave stuff at a radio station, leaving it on the bus station. It's not going to be there when you get back. And that the Madden family was all on board with the project. And in fact, Joe Madden, John's number 2 son, financed the transcription of all of those audio files. All I had to do was get them into MP3 form, which took several months of ripping.
I was going to say, what took longer, the audio or the writing?
The writing didn't take all that long, to be honest. I mean, one thing is I write fast. I learned to do it through my career. I would say wrangling the audio took longer than anything else. Get it all uploaded and use a service that was able to transcribe all those into text, because now, instead of having to go back and listen to all this stuff, I can do keyword search and find all the episodes about concussions or whenever he talked about turducken or whatever.
You talked about John's love of local baseball. What do you think John would have thought of the Ballers?
I think he would have loved it. He would have absolutely loved the concept. John loves sports. John got the business of sports, but understood that at its core, what makes sports work for both fan and player and coach is the sense of optimism, the sense of excitement, the sense of community, that being a fan, it's based on a love, you know, kind of, it's usually unrequited. Right. But no, John would have loved it. He would have absolutely loved it. John was also vehemently for Oakland. Anything Oakland, John was for. I know it tore him up that the Raiders left and then left again. It was tough for him because he had a relationship with Al Davis and the Davis family. Without Al Davis plucking this obscure linebacker coach out of San Diego State and then making him head coach, you know, at a tender age, none of this happens.
How many times when you would be on with John, and here we are, fairly buttoned up KCBS, did you just kind of look away and go, how am I able to do this here?
I know. This was what I mentioned earlier. This was the opening of my blossom. The deal was originally, it was supposed to be maybe a 5-minute, maybe a 10-minute segment. And on KCBS, man, everything runs like freaking clockwork. We did traffic and weather on the 8s, 8, 18, 28, 38, 48, 58 minutes past the hour, religiously. If we were going to go to John Madden at 15 past, we were going to miss the 18 traffic report. And now we've got a business report at 25 and another traffic report at 28. And by the way, some commercials need to be played. These things would stretch on. Famously, on the very first day, John came on KCBS with Al Hart, my predecessor. Producer gets on with him just before he goes on. Mr. Madden, remember, this is KCBS. I know whatever you've done before at the other stations, this is all news. Things move really fast. And John's like, yeah, I know. He's sitting with his sons, Mike and Joe, out in Pleasanton when he does it. And as Mike told the story, John then looks at them and goes, watch this. So they get to the end of the segment, and poor Al Hart is like under the gun. The clock is ticking. There are people in the newsroom looking at their watches, or you know, everybody's ready. Al starts to wrap it up, and John goes, "Oh yeah, Al, and another thing." And he would do that all the time. And of course, that was the best stuff. But see, I had a colleague, Steve Bitker, the sports guy, whose job it was to lift a piece of the morning Madden thing and set it up for replay later in the day so we could charge some more money, hopefully, to advertisers for the Madden replays. Well, Steve was looking for something about sports. And there would be days where we maybe didn't talk about sports. And poor Steve would be, you know, on his edge of his seat right at the end. He'd go, well, John, what about that play in the third quarter last night where the middle line, and, you know, you could almost hear John at his end roll his eyes. Say, all right, Steve, I'll give you what you need for later, but let's get back to that thing about the turducken, you know. It gave KCBS two things. Number one, some personality. Number two, it more deeply rooted us in being local. John was a local guy, and to have a local guy who could throw out references to old times and old places in the Bay Area, people were streaming into the region in those years, you know, the Silicon Valley crowd and then San Francisco.com and tech crowd. And for all these people to have a new place to go where there were old stories being told was of incalculable value to the radio station.
The relationship you forged with John on this show reminds me, and this is an odd comparison, but stay with me. A guy named Blair Fisher, who was a rock journalist for a while and then got out of the field, wound up accidentally emailing Eddie Van Halen. And they had a 5-year email conversation that he then published as an article in Rolling Stone. And it was the most insightful look into Eddie Van Halen because Eddie wasn't dealing with the usual people. As I read your book, or you read your book to me, I should say, I'm thinking, this reminds me of Fisher and Van Halen, that different level of connection.
Kevin Radich, Kevin the Rat, who was a colleague for many years and a sportscaster, he'd worked with John at KNBR. I was looking around as I wrote the book to ask a question that I never really got a satisfactory answer myself to the question, why did John do this?
Right.
I mean, John Madden.
Right.
I mean, this guy was huge.
And I don't think people understand that at one point in the Madden video game franchise, John was making more money than anyone on the field.
At one point during his television broadcasting career, there were years that he was making more money than any player in the NFL then, and he wasn't the lead broadcaster. Why would he keep getting up? He didn't actually have to get up that much because most of the time he was in far time zones. But Kevin's take was, A, local, B, he could color outside the lines. You know, when you're doing those NFL broadcast, John had about 12 seconds, 15 seconds between plays to be John Madden. With us, he could be as John Madden as he wanted for as long as he wanted. And he used to always say he did it to keep his mom apprised of where he was, what he was up to, so he didn't have to call her. And I used to take that at face value and think, man, when Mary Madden passes away, and she's not young, she lived to be close to 100 or past 100, you know, he's going to quit. And when he came on that morning with the news, his mom had passed, you know, we expressed sympathy. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh boy, he'll be gone tomorrow. But it wasn't like that.
I listened to your audiobook recording, which was really wonderful. And I have kind of an inside baseball question. Announcing versus narrating. Did you bump into any problems?
Oh, man. Because I was using this tool that I mentioned earlier that I could upload all the audio, have transcriptions. I could copy blocks of text, paste them into my manuscript, but it would also create a sort of hybrid manuscript that had the audio with it. So I'm thinking all the way along the way, every time I paste a quote of John Madden into my book manuscript, I'm also pasting the audio of John Madden into the eventual script for the audiobook. This will be awesome. You'll be able to hear all of these segments. Literally, like weeks before the audiobook's got to be published, I get an email from my publisher, my book publisher, saying, oh, the audiobook publisher would like to use you to do the audiobook. Are you available? And I was in France at the time. I'm thinking, oh my God, I started trying to track down a recording studio in Monaco. I mean, it was crazy. I thought, well, yeah, I can do that. They're willing to pay me a little bit for it. I still assumed that they would just use these chunks. Well, the reason they didn't was that the rights to all that audio, unlike anything you ever did on the radio or I ever did on the radio, all our work was owned by the boss man. John Madden owned his work. It was he had that kind of leverage. I'm not sure what the family would have said. I think they might have said yes, but nobody, was willing to go have that conversation.
Big patch of ways.
Right. So then I thought, well, we'll just get a second voice who can read the Madden parts. So I end up over at a recording studio, a really good place in San Francisco. I settle in, and they've got the script all on an iPad, and I'm waiting for somebody from the audiobook publisher, like a producer, to walk me through how this is going to go. And there was one really good but very young recording engineer on the other side of the glass. And I finally said, well, how do we do this? He goes, well, you just read, and, if you make any mistakes, I'll be following along, and I'll stop you, and we'll pick up. I said, but I mean, the parts about the quotes, how do I do that? He goes, just change your voice a little, maybe. And it was all done in a day and a half.
Really?
Or maybe 2.5 days of recording. Yeah, I was just banging it out. If you listen to it, I think my Madden at the beginning was a little tentative.
Right.
A little tentative. I got a little more Madden as it went along. But I didn't want to be cartoonish about it either. It had to be set apart. I don't know. It was a very strange experience. I'm glad I got to do it.
It does work. I listened to the book primarily while riding my bicycle, and it was a great the transitions were wonderful.
Yeah. It was fun to do. I'm glad I got a chance to do it. I still think in a perfect world, the version of it where you actually hear John would be something special. Who knows? Maybe that'll still happen someday.
Speaking of multimedia, any thoughts on the upcoming Madden movie?
I don't have a problem seeing Nick Cage pulling off John Madden. Nick Cage can get into that sort of manic space, which Madden definitely could. Christian Bale as Al Davis. Maybe.
He's a chameleon. We'll trust it.
Yeah. But the one I love is Kathryn Hahn playing Virginia Madden, because Virginia Madden, I mean, there needs to be a book and maybe a separate documentary series about Virginia. Really? She is a force of nature, a remarkable story unto herself. She really is a remarkable person. I'm glad she's still around. I'm sure Kathryn Hahn will do her justice. And I hope the script does Virginia justice, because she's an important part of the story.
Going back to CHRS and going back to your work in basically audio archaeology, I was at the CHRS Christmas party, and you gave a pretty impassioned speech about a lot of the work you're doing in digging into the archives. Did your experience with the Madden book sort of push you a little more to do a little more archive work?
Yeah, although I would say it started earlier than that. We were lucky at KCBS that a lot of audio had gotten saved over the years on reel-to-reel tapes and shoved back in the dusty storage closet. Made the move from the Palace Hotel, where the station had been located from the 40s all the way to 1971. From 71 to 2000, we were at the Embarcadero Center high-rise. And by the time I was working my last go-round, we were on Battery Street, and this stuff was still there in boxes, reel-to-reel tapes, stuff that went way back to the 50s and 60s. I created a podcast series then called The News Vault by going and digitizing as many of those reels as I could. It had gotten me started on the notion that this stuff is going away or getting lost or will be tossed if somebody doesn't do something with it. And it was just KCBS. That's all I knew. That's all I had. There's a whole subculture of air check collectors.
Right.
So I retire, and I am downstairs in the very building where we're recording this interview, and here are boxes and boxes and boxes of cassettes and reels and tape cartridges. And I'm thinking, man, what am I going to do with this stuff? So now we're embarked on a project to inventory and discard non-useful stuff to make sure we know everything we have here that's in analog form. And then the next hill we have to climb is to digitize. Can we digitize all of it? Not in my lifetime, probably. Do we need to? Maybe not also, right? It's a fair question. Do we need every single KCBS hourly air check that's in those boxes, or everyone from, we've got a big pile from KBLX. It's a legendary station also, but what do we need? How do we do it? The good news is the technology is helping us. If we can get it into digital form, then it's trivial to do a text transcription. And then we can very quickly put an AI bot onto it and say, find me all the ones with Carter B. Smith or whatever. I'm pretty passionate about it because radio, let's say 1922-ish, 20, started to become the dominant popular medium.
Right.
And for 100 years, it was the pulse of America. What do we care about musically? What do we argue about? How do we learn things? And I think that gets forgotten. Newspaper archives are great. Radio's never had an archive. And most of what was broadcast in my career and anybody else's is gone. We weren't recording it. What was the point? And I remember interviewing Brewster Kahle when I was covering technology. Brewster's the guy who started the Internet Archive. And Brewster's original idea was one that I kind of keep in mind. The internet is changing every millisecond. He said, if we don't catch this now, who's going to know what was on XYZ.com on May 3rd, 1997? What about radio? How's that going to be preserved?
You've got company coming in from out of town. You have to take them to 3 different meals at 3 different restaurants in Alameda. Where are you going?
Well, these days, probably Saltbreaker, and maybe if the weather is good, which it often isn't out there, the outdoor part of Saltbreaker. I kind of like hanging out there. They're nice folks. It's a nice little deal. My local is the Park Street Grill. You know, this is not highbrow, but because I love the owners, the 1400 Bar and Grill.
It is tough to go wrong there.
Yeah, and they got the greatest bones, right? Because that building goes back to the 1880s. And there are lots of 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th place joints in town that I would definitely recommend too.
How can people keep up with what you're up to?
Well, BayAreaRadio.org is our website. It's the Bay Area Radio Museum and Hall of Fame. We're trying to ramp up fresh content there. To be honest, most of it's being written by me. And I'm looking forward to the day when I can find some other fellow travelers here who want to write Bay Area radio history. One of our other goals is to write a station bio of every station that's ever been on the air in the Bay Area.
Wow.
My personal website for the book is stanbunger.com. Buy books. Books are important. They're not making me rich. I can assure you that. If anybody has the thought that being an author is going to pay the bills, get rid of the thought tomorrow.
But it is an absolutely wonderful book, and I really have to compliment you on the job you did, not only writing it, but voicing it as well for the audiobook. And for those locals, if you want the book, we have local bookstores. Head on down to Booksync.
Yeah, absolutely. Booksync, another great Alameda asset. We're lucky to have a local bookstore. We're lucky to have locally owned restaurants. We're lucky to have a facility like this and the Pinball Museum. And, Alameda's it's perfect town. It's not too big, not too small, easy to get to other places from. The weather's pretty good, and the people are generally nice.
Stan Bunger, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for sitting down with us on the Alameda Connection.
Thanks for having me. It's really been a joy.
Take care. Thanks again to Stan Bunger, Bay Area Radio Hall of Famer and the author of Mornings with Madden, for spending time with us this morning on the Alameda Connection. To keep up with what's going on with Stan and the Mornings with Madden book, and to submit your own Madden memory, head to stanbunger.com. That's StanBunger.com. To learn more about the history of Bay Area radio in general, you'll want to check out Stan's contributions at bayarearadio.org. Coming up next week on the Alameda Connection, one of the most surprising restaurant stories of the last few years. In 2023, when Fix-Q Barbecue opened on Park Street, who would have imagined that a restaurant specializing in Texas barbecue with an Indonesian halal twist would land on the list of the New York Times 50 favorite restaurants in America? My guest is Rekha Saleh, one half of the husband and wife team that brings you Fix-Q Barbecue. As always, thank you to the California Historical Radio Society for providing the location for my sit-down with Stan Bunger. And as we do each and every week, special thanks to jazz guitarist Bill Hart for our theme music. The song is Beachside Isle, and the album is Watch the Sky. I'm Scott Piehler. I'll catch you next week, Sunday morning at 8, the Alameda Connection on KCSM HD2.